The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Officer James Mitchell, a 28-year-old member of the Queen's Guard, dressed in his iconic red tunic and tall black bearskin hat. He had been serving in this prestigious position for 3 years, and the routine had become second nature to him. James took his post seriously. The Queen's Guard were not just ceremonial figures. They were active soldiers trained to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of the monarchy. Every morning, he would stand perfectly still for hours, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Tourists would often try to make him laugh, take selfies with him, or even touch his uniform, but James had learned to ignore it all. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, the crowd was larger than usual. School groups, families from around the world, and curious onlookers filled the area around the palace gates. James noticed a small group approaching from his peripheral vision. It was a family that seemed different from the typical tourists. They moved more slowly, and there was something about their demeanor that caught his attention, though he maintained his stoic pose. The family consisted of an elderly woman in a wheelchair, a middle-aged man who appeared to be her son, and a young boy of about 10 years old. The woman looked frail, her hands trembling slightly as they rested on the arms of her wheelchair. Her eyes, however, were bright and alert, taking in everything around her with wonder. The man pushing the wheelchair spoke softly to his mother, pointing out various aspects of the palace architecture. The young boy walked beside them, occasionally running ahead to get a better view before returning to his grandmother's side. There was a tenderness in their interactions that stood out among the bustling crowd of tourists. As they approached James's position, he could hear fragments of their conversation. The elderly woman was speaking about her late husband, mentioning something about his service during World War II. Her voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness that resonated even through James's professional detachment. The family stopped in front of James, and the woman in the wheelchair looked up at him with genuine admiration. Her son began explaining to her the significance of the Queen's Guard, their history, and their role in protecting the monarchy. The young boy listened intently, his eyes wide with fascination as he stared at James's imposing figure. James had encountered thousands of visitors during his service, but something about this family felt different. Perhaps it was the respect they showed, or the way the elderly woman's eyes seemed to hold stories of their own. Despite his training to remain detached, he found himself more aware of their presence than usual. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph, showing it to her son and grandson. From his position, James couldn't see the image clearly, but he could tell it was something significant to the family. The conversation that followed seemed emotional, with the woman wiping away tears as she spoke about the past. As the minutes passed, more tourists gathered around, but the family remained in their spot. The woman in her wheelchair positioned directly in front of James. She seemed to be gathering courage for something, her hands fidgeting with the photograph as she looked up at the stoic guard. The morning continued with its usual rhythm of ceremony and spectacle, but James found himself increasingly curious about this particular family. Their quiet dignity and obvious emotional connection to the place suggested they weren't just casual tourists. There was a story here, one that was about to unfold in a way that would surprise everyone present. The elderly woman finally made her decision. With the help of her son, she began to rise from her wheelchair, her movement slow and deliberate. The crowd around them noticed the change and began to pay closer attention, sensing that something significant was about to happen. James maintained his position, but internally, he was preparing for whatever was coming next. In his 3 years of service, he had learned that sometimes the most unexpected moments came from the most genuine human connections. This morning was about to become one of those moments that would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. The woman stood shakily, supported by her son, her eyes never leaving James's face as she prepared to do something that would shock everyone watching. Margaret Thompson had been planning this trip to London for 2 years. At 84 years old, she knew this might be her last chance to fulfill a promise she had made to her late husband, George, before he passed away 5 years earlier. The photograph clutched in her trembling hands showed a young soldier in uniform, standing proudly outside Buckingham Palace in 1943. George Thompson had served as a guard at Buckingham Palace during World War II, one of the brave men who protected the royal family during the darkest days of the Blitz. He had often told Margaret stories about his service, about the long nights watching for enemy aircraft, about the responsibility he felt protecting King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, and about the camaraderie among the guards. Margaret's son, David, had initially been reluctant to bring his elderly mother on such a long journey from their home in Yorkshire. But when she explained the significance of the trip, how she needed to honor George's memory and show her grandson Thomas where his grandfather had served with such pride, David couldn't refuse. Thomas, now 10 years old, had heard countless stories about his grandfather's war service, but seeing the actual place where it all happened was bringing those tales to life. His young imagination was filled with images of his grandfather standing in the same spot where the current guard now stood, protecting the royal family from danger. As Margaret stood on unsteady legs, supported by David's strong arms, she looked directly at James Mitchell. In her mind, she wasn't seeing just any guard. She was seeing her beloved George, young and proud in his uniform. The resemblance was startling. The same serious expression, the same dedication to duty, the same unwavering stance. The crowd around them began to whisper and point, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Most tourists kept their distance from the guards, knowing they were not supposed to interfere with their duties. But Margaret had something more important than protocol driving her forward. She reached out her weathered hand toward James, her fingers barely reaching his red tunic. Her voice, though weak with age, carried clearly across the courtyard as she spoke. "Thank you, son. Thank you for your service, just like my George." The crowd fell silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something profound. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she continued, "My husband stood where you stand now during the war. He protected their majesties with the same honor you show today." James felt something stir within him that went against all his training. This wasn't a tourist trying to get a reaction or take a funny photo. This was a widow honoring her husband's memory and recognizing the continuity of service that connected past and present. Margaret slowly opened her arms, the photograph still clutched in one hand, and moved toward James as if to embrace him. The crowd gasped, expecting the guard to step back or call for assistance. Such physical contact was strictly forbidden, and everyone knew that the Queen's Guard were trained to maintain their positions no matter what. But as Margaret's frail arms reached around James's waist in a gentle grandmother-like hug, something extraordinary happened. Instead of maintaining his rigid posture or stepping away, James did something that surprised everyone watching, including himself. His training told him to remain still, to not acknowledge the embrace, to maintain the dignity of his position. But his humanity told him something different. This elderly woman wasn't disrespecting his role. She was honoring it in the most heartfelt way possible. David watched with amazement as his mother found the strength to complete her embrace. He had never seen her look so peaceful since his father's death. Young Thomas stared wide-eyed, understanding that his grandmother was doing something very special and brave. The other tourists began pulling out their phones and cameras, but not with the usual casual attitude of sightseers. They sensed they were witnessing something genuine and moving, a moment that transcended the usual boundaries between performers and audience, between duty and compassion. James could feel Margaret's slight frame against his uniform, could sense the love and grief and gratitude flowing from this woman who had traveled so far to make this connection. In that moment, he faced a choice that would define not just this encounter, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The seconds stretched out as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented situation would unfold, how a trained soldier would respond to such an unexpected display of genuine emotion and respect. James Mitchell felt the weight of every eye upon him as Margaret Thompson's arms encircled his waist. Time seemed suspended in that moment, with hundreds of tourists holding their breath, waiting to see how he would respond to this unprecedented breach of protocol. His superior officers had drilled into him the importance of maintaining discipline at all times. The Queen's Guard do not react. they had said countless times during training. You are a symbol of British resolve and dignity. Nothing should move you from your post or break your composure. Yet as James looked down at this elderly woman, who barely reached his chest, he saw something that transcended all the rules and regulations. He saw genuine respect, profound gratitude, and a love that connected across generations of service. Margaret wasn't trying to make him break character for entertainment. She was honoring a tradition that her own husband had been part of. In that split second, James made a decision that would shock everyone present. Instead of remaining rigid and emotionless, he slowly brought his white-gloved hands up and gently, carefully, returned Margaret's embrace. The crowd gasped audibly as they witnessed something that had never been seen before in the long history of the Queen's Guard. James's response was measured and respectful, but unmistakably real. He lowered his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the woman in his arms, and in a voice so quiet that only she could hear, he whispered, "It would be my honor to serve alongside your husband, ma'am." Margaret's tears flowed freely now, not from sadness but from overwhelming gratitude. She had hoped for a moment of connection, but she never expected such kindness from a man bound by such strict rules. In James's embrace, she felt as though George himself was acknowledging her pilgrimage to this sacred place. The photograph in her hand fluttered slightly in the breeze, and James noticed it. Still maintaining their gentle embrace, he glanced down at the black and white image of a young soldier who looked remarkably similar to himself. The resemblance was uncanny. The same strong jawline, the same serious eyes, the same proud bearing. David Thompson watched in amazement as his mother experienced this moment of connection. He had worried that the trip might be too much for her. That disappointment might outweigh any satisfaction she found. But seeing her face now, seeing the peace that had settled over her features, he knew they had made the right decision to come. Young Thomas tugged at his father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, why is the soldier hugging Grandma? I thought they weren't allowed to move." David whispered back, "Sometimes, son, there are things more important than rules. That guard understands what Grandma needed to do, and he's showing her the respect that Grandpa deserves." The crowd around them had grown larger, but instead of the usual chattering and jostling for better positions, an unusual quiet had settled over the area. People seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special, something that deserved reverence rather than casual observation. Other members of the Queen's Guard, positioned at different points around the palace, maintained their posts, but couldn't help but notice the unusual scene unfolding near their colleague. They had all been trained to handle disruptions, but this situation was unlike anything in their experience. James knew that his actions would likely result in questions from his superiors, possibly even disciplinary action. The Queen's Guard were expected to be immovable, regardless of circumstances. But as he held this frail woman who had traveled so far to honor her husband's memory, he felt certain that his decision was right. Margaret slowly pulled back from the embrace, her hands resting briefly on James's chest as she looked up into his face. "George would be so proud to know that men like you still serve," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. James wanted to respond, to tell her that he was proud to serve in the same capacity as her husband, but his training reasserted itself. He straightened slightly, returning to his formal posture, though his eyes remained kind as they met hers. The moment was brief, lasting perhaps 30 seconds in total, but its impact rippled through the crowd like a wave. Phones and cameras had captured every second, and already people were whispering about what they had just witnessed. As Margaret allowed David to help her back into her wheelchair, she pressed the photograph into James's gloved hand. "Keep this," she said softly. "George would want you to have it, one guardian to another." James looked down at the photograph, then back at Margaret, knowing that this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. He carefully tucked the image into his tunic, close to his heart where it would remain throughout his shift. News of the extraordinary encounter spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within minutes of the embrace, dozens of videos and photographs were being shared across social media platforms. The hashtag #RoyalGuardHeart began trending worldwide as people shared the footage of James Mitchell's compassionate response to Margaret Thompson's gesture. The video clips showed the entire sequence. Margaret rising from her wheelchair, approaching James with determination, embracing him with obvious emotion, and then the moment that shocked everyone, James returning the embrace with gentle dignity. The contrast between his imposing military bearing and his tender response created an image that touched hearts around the globe. Major Richard Pemberton, the commanding officer responsible for the Queen's Guard detail that day, received notification of the incident within 20 minutes. His initial reaction was concern. Breaking protocol was serious business, and there would need to be an investigation. But as he watched the footage himself, he found his perspective shifting. Pemberton had served for 25 years, and he understood the weight of tradition and discipline that defined the Queen's Guard. However, he also recognized genuine respect and honor when he saw it. The elderly woman wasn't mocking or testing the Guard, she was paying tribute to the institution he represented. Meanwhile, Margaret, David, and Thomas had moved to a nearby cafe to process what had just happened. Margaret clutched David's hand, still overwhelmed by the kindness James had shown her. He understood, she kept saying. That young man understood what George meant to me, what this place meant to us. Thomas was full of questions about his grandfather's service, energized by seeing the connection between past and present. David found himself explaining more about World War II, about the courage required to serve during such dangerous times, and about how the tradition of service continued through people like James. Back at his post, James maintained his professional composure, but internally he was reflecting on his decision. He had acted on instinct, responding to something deeper than training or protocol. The photograph tucked against his chest felt warm, as if it carried the spirit of all the guards who had served before him. The crowd around James had not dispersed as usual. Instead, people lingered, many approaching with their own stories of military service in their families. A veteran from the Falklands War gave him a quiet salute. A woman whose brother had served in Afghanistan nodded respectfully. The encounter with Margaret had opened something in the atmosphere, creating a bridge between the ceremonial and the personal. By afternoon, the story had reached major news networks. BBC News ran the story with the headline, "Queen's Guard shows heart in touching. Palace encounter." International outlets picked up the story, with many focusing on how a moment of human compassion had transcended rigid military protocol. Social media was flooded with responses from people around the world. Veterans shared their own stories of service and sacrifice. Families posted photographs of their own military relatives. Many commented on how James's response showed that discipline and compassion could coexist, that following one's heart didn't always mean breaking one's duty. Some criticism emerged from military traditionalists who argued that any deviation from protocol was unacceptable regardless of circumstances. They maintained that the Queen's Guard existed as symbols of unwavering discipline, and that emotions had no place in their duty. However, the overwhelming response was positive. Retired military officers praised James's judgment, noting that true leadership sometimes required making difficult decisions in unprecedented situations. Many pointed out that his response honored both the institution he served and the legacy of those who had served before him. As James's shift neared its end, he reflected on how one moment of human connection had created such widespread impact. He had simply responded to an elderly woman's gesture of respect, but somehow that simple act had resonated with people around the world. The photograph against his chest reminded him that military service was ultimately about serving people, protecting what they valued, and honoring those who had made sacrifices for future generations. Margaret's husband George had understood this during his own service, and now James carried forward that understanding in his own way. When his replacement arrived for the next shift, James finally allowed himself to relax his posture. The day had been unlike any other in his 3 years of service, and he knew it would influence how he approached his duties going forward. As he walked toward the guardhouse to conclude his duty, James was unaware that his actions had already reached the highest levels of military command, and that decisions were being made about how to respond to his breach of protocol. The next few days would determine whether his moment of compassion would be viewed as a mistake or as an example of service at its finest. The following morning, James Mitchell was summoned to report to Colonel Andrew Hartwell, the senior commanding officer of the Household Division. James had spent a restless night wondering about the consequences of his actions, knowing that breaking protocol could result in anything from a formal reprimand to removal from the prestigious Queen's Guard unit. As he walked through the corridors of Wellington Barracks, James passed fellow guardsmen who offered supportive nods and encouraging words. The story had spread throughout the military community overnight, and opinion was divided between those who admired his compassion and those who believed he had compromised the integrity of his position. Colonel Hartwell, a decorated officer with 30 years of service, sat behind his desk reviewing the incident reports and media coverage. The story had gained such international attention that he had received calls from senior military officials, palace representatives, and even members of parliament. The situation required careful handling. When James entered the office and stood at attention, Colonel Hartwell studied him carefully. "Guardsman Mitchell," he began, his tone measured and serious. "Yesterday's events have created quite a stir. I've reviewed the footage, read the incident reports, and considered the various perspectives on your actions." James remained silent, knowing that protocol required him to respond only when directly asked a question. His heart pounded as he waited to learn his fate. "Tell me," the colonel continued, "what went through your mind when that elderly woman approached you?" James chose his words carefully. "Sir, I saw a woman honoring her late husband's service and the institution we represent. Her gesture was one of profound respect, not disrespect. In that moment, I felt that responding with equal respect would honor both her husband's memory and the values we serve to protect." Colonel Hartwell leaned back in his chair, considering the response. "You understand that the Queen's Guard are expected to maintain composure and position regardless of external circumstances. This expectation exists for important reasons. It demonstrates our unwavering commitment and creates a symbol of reliability that the public can depend upon." "Yes, sir," James replied. "I understand the importance of discipline and protocol. I don't take my breach of those expectations lightly." The colonel stood and walked to his window, looking out at the parade ground where guards were conducting their morning drill. After a long moment, he turned back to James. "However, I've also received some interesting communications in the past 12 hours. He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Please send her in," he said quietly. The door opened, and to James's amazement, Margaret Thompson entered the room, supported by her son David. She had requested this meeting through official channels, traveling back to London specifically to speak on James's behalf. "Colonel Hartwell," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day, "I understand that this young man may face consequences for his kindness to me yesterday. I cannot allow that to happen without speaking for him." David helped his mother into a chair facing the colonel's desk, while James remained at attention, confused by this unexpected development. Margaret continued, "My husband, George Thompson, served as a guard here during the war. He always told me that the greatest honor of military service was protecting what matters most, not buildings or protocols, but the values and people those things represent. Yesterday, Guardsman Mitchell protected something precious, the memory of service and the dignity of sacrifice." Colonel Hartwell listened intently as Margaret explained her journey to London, her husband's stories of wartime service, and her need to connect with the continuing tradition of the Queen's Guard. She spoke of how James's response had given her peace about her husband's legacy and had shown her grandson the true meaning of honorable service. "My husband always said," Margaret concluded, "that the best soldiers know when to follow orders and when to follow their hearts. Yesterday, this young man did both." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled. Colonel Hartwell had been prepared to deliver discipline, but Margaret's testimony had shifted the entire context of the situation. After Margaret and David left, Colonel Hartwell returned to his desk and looked directly at James. "Guardsman Mitchell, what happened yesterday has put me in a difficult position. On one hand, you clearly violated established protocol. On the other hand, you demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, compassion, and understanding of service that we hope to develop in our finest soldiers." James waited, unsure which direction the conversation would take. "I've also received a communication from Buckingham Palace itself," the colonel continued. "It seems that the Queen herself has been made aware of yesterday's incident." Her Majesty's response was enlightening. The colonel picked up an official document from his desk. Her Majesty commented that the Queen's Guard serve not just to protect the monarchy, but to represent the best values of the nation. She felt that your response yesterday exemplified those values perfectly. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he maintained his military bearing. Therefore, Colonel Hartwell concluded, rather than disciplinary action, you'll be receiving a commendation for demonstrating exceptional judgment and representing the Guard with distinction under unprecedented circumstances. 3 months after the incident that captured hearts worldwide, James Mitchell found himself in an extraordinary position. The photograph Margaret Thompson had given him now sat framed on his bedside table, but its significance had grown far beyond personal remembrance. The Royal British Legion, a charity supporting veterans and their families, had contacted James to ask if he would participate in a special ceremony honoring wartime service. Margaret's story and James's response had inspired a new initiative to bridge connections between current service members and veterans' families. On a crisp December morning, James stood once again at Buckingham Palace, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. Instead of his usual solitary post, he was joined by Margaret Thompson, who had become an unexpected symbol of the enduring connection between past and present service. The ceremony was designed to honor the continuity of military service across generations. Veterans from conflicts spanning from World War II to recent operations in Afghanistan and Iraq gathered with their families, alongside current service members from all branches of the military. Margaret, now 95 and even more frail than before, sat in her wheelchair beside James as he stood at attention. But today his stance was different. It was still professional and dignified, but there was a warmth in his bearing that reflected the lessons he had learned from their encounter. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke about the sacred nature of service and sacrifice, about how the values of duty, honor, and compassion formed an unbroken chain connecting all those who had served their country. As he spoke, James thought about the photograph tucked close to his heart, about George Thompson's service during the darkest days of the war, and about how one moment of human connection had changed his understanding of what it meant to serve. When the Archbishop concluded his remarks, Margaret was helped to her feet. With surprising strength, she addressed the assembled crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite her age. "When my George served here during the war," she began, "he told me that the true measure of a soldier wasn't just in following orders, but in understanding why those orders mattered. Yesterday's soldiers protected us from physical threats. Today's soldiers protect the values that make protection worthwhile." She turned to James, who remained at attention beside her. "This young man understood that when I needed to honor my husband's memory, I wasn't asking him to break his duty. I was asking him to fulfill it in its deepest sense." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, a rare sound in the usually formal atmosphere of palace ceremonies. James felt tears forming in his eyes but maintained his composure, understanding now that discipline and emotion weren't opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true service. Following the ceremony, James was approached by dozens of families, each with their own stories of military service. A widow whose husband had died in Iraq thanked him for showing that compassion had a place in military service. A young boy whose father was deployed overseas told James he wanted to be a guard someday too, not just to protect buildings, but to protect what buildings represented. The media coverage of the follow-up ceremony was extensive but different in tone from the initial viral videos. News outlets focused on the deeper meaning of the encounter, on how it had sparked conversations about the nature of military service, respect for veterans, and the importance of human connection in an increasingly digital world. James returned to his regular duties with a transformed perspective. The routine remained the same: standing guard, maintaining discipline, protecting the dignity of the monarchy. But his understanding of why these duties mattered had deepened considerably. The photograph Margaret had given him became a daily reminder that he served not just an institution, but a continuous tradition of service that connected him to every soldier who had stood guard before him and would stand guard after him. 6 months later, James received an unexpected letter from Thomas, Margaret's grandson, now 11 years old. The boy wrote that he had decided to join his school's cadet program. Inspired by the story of his grandfather and by James's example, he included a drawing of a guard standing at Buckingham Palace, but in the drawing, the guard was smiling. Margaret Thompson passed away peacefully in her sleep 8 months after her encounter with James Mitchell. At her funeral, James served as an honorary pallbearer, wearing his dress uniform and carrying the flag that had been presented to George Thompson upon his retirement from service decades earlier. As he stood at attention during the funeral service, James reflected on how one moment of human connection had rippled outward, touching thousands of lives and changing his own understanding of service forever. The encounter had taught him that the highest form of military discipline wasn't rigid adherence to rules, but the wisdom to know when breaking those rules served a higher purpose. The story of the visitor who embraced a royal guard and his shocking response became more than just a viral moment. It became a reminder that behind every uniform stands a human being, and that true service requires not just courage and discipline, but compassion and understanding as well. Today, James continues to serve as a Queen's Guard, carrying forward the legacy of all those who served before him, including George Thompson, whose photograph still rests close to his heart during every shift.